Okay, so this next guest is a clinical psychologist in Southern California. She has over 10 years' experience as a clinician in the mental health field and specializes in helping people achieve healthy relationships with the self and others by empowering them with a deep understanding of how past life experiences contribute to current struggles. In addition to providing psychotherapy in private practice, Dr. Chung maintains a professional social media account on Instagram under the handle lovealways.drbetsy, where she shares insights about tips about self esteem and relationships. Dr. Chung also contributes her time and expertise to various media outlets, including Tyla on TikTok and Share Care Inc., and has been featured in magazines like Cosmopolitan and Health Magazine. Please welcome Dr. Betsy.
Hi,
Yay!
so
What a
nice to
great
meet you
bio.
guys. Oh, thank
And,
you.
and what I love about that bio is it teases what we're going to talk about in the episode, which is kind of how you empower us to find better self esteem and self sufficiency, and how a lot of that relates to past relationships and how we grew up and our relationships with our parents. So, our first question for you is going to be like, how did you end up in this field? Like, what got you to specifically focusing on this specific topic?
hmm So it's kind of interesting because it's kind of like a short but also long story. I guess I'll give you the condensed version. I stumbled into psychology really by chance. Growing up, I had no idea what I wanted to do for a living. In talking about self-esteem, I guess that I didn't have extremely high self-confidence because I felt like, my sister, like my oldest sister, she was really great at math. She eventually became an architect. My next one was very artistically creative. She eventually became a fashion designer. So when I went to college, I was like, wait, what am I good at? And I didn't really feel like I was good at anything. But because I went into college undeclared, I needed to meet with a peer counselor. And she was like, well, what's something that you think you're good at? And I was like, I don't know. The only thing that makes me stand out is I'm athletic, compared to my sisters. And so I was like, I guess I can be a fitness trainer. She's like, well, I don't really have anything like fitness training, that you can major in, but what about psychology? So she kind of just threw psychology out there. And I was like, yeah, sure, I guess. And so I took my very first psychology class and I loved it. And then I kept taking more psychology classes and loved that. And so basically, I went from taking my first psychology class to, eventually working as an assistant at a psych office, and then decided to attend graduate school because another friend of mine said that he was going to graduate school to become a psychologist. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do that too.
Oh my
So
God.
yeah, and speaking of like self esteem and what I'm good at and stuff, it's not something that I felt like I was kind of raised to do, or that I kind of knew this about myself.
Yeah.
I guess where I can talk a little bit about how I got into this topic of self worth is. When I started graduate school, I honestly thought that I was going to work with like the Asian American community and teenagers. I grew up in an environment where my parents were very, traditional and conservative. And so that meant that, I needed to be very respectful toward adults and authority. And so all of that, it really impacted my self-esteem because I think growing up, I really felt like, that I didn't really have much of a say as a child. Every time I dealt with anybody that I thought was an adult, I would kind of, I would kind of get a little bit scared, and I would kind of, buckle a little bit if I needed to communicate with them for any reason. But it was also a little confusing because on the one hand, my mom raised me to be very, respectful of adults, but then my mom also was a very independent person. And so she always raised us to learn how to stand up for ourselves as well. And so it was kind of a confusing thing for me
Mm.
growing up. So on the one hand, I was expected to respect adults and no matter what, and I needed to be obedient. But then on the other hand, I was expected to stand up for myself and express my feelings and express my needs. And when I wasn't able to do that, I felt terrible about myself. And I felt
Mm,
like, oh, you're so weak and what's wrong with you? And I never
mm,
realized any of this stuff and how it had impacted me until I went to graduate school and I was interning at a psych hospital. And I had this exchange with I had this exchange with a staff member there. He was, it's funny. I was about to call him an adult, but the truth of the matter is, I was already an adult. But he was older than me, and what had happened was he ended up, kind of scolding me in front of a client,
mm,
and I didn't know what to do, and I just kind of froze. So when I talked to my supervisor about it later on, she said, you sometimes come off a little bit sheepish. And when she said that, I was like, oh my God, what is that word? Like, that is so humiliating. She called me sheepish. Like, that's the
oh,
last thing that I wanted to hear.
wow.
But then one of the things that she said after that, she said, have you ever heard of assertiveness? And I said, no, I don't know what assertiveness is. She's like, look it up. So I
Mm,
went home that day. I looked up assertiveness and my jaw just dropped. I was like, oh my God, there is actually a word for what I've been experiencing.
mm,
Like, like there's actually a word that describes how I've been feeling around adults and what I need to do around adults that I never really learned how to do when I was growing up. So I guess, to connect that to what I was saying earlier about how I got into, self-esteem and stuff, is that I initially thought that I wanted to work with the Asian population and teenagers because when I was, because I thought like, well, that was my experience. I grew up in an Asian background, and I really kind of felt like I could empathize with teenagers and all of the generational stuff in the community. But then when I started working with that community, I realized I was like, oh no, I cannot work with teenagers, because when I worked with teenagers, that meant I needed to work with their parents. And working with
mm.
their parents meant like, well, there goes the authority, right? The Asian
Yeah.
authority. So slowly I started to realize like, okay, I don't think that that's the right population for me. But this
Mm,
assertiveness stuff and this boundary stuff, it just really, really made sense. And
mm,
the more that I learned about it, the more that everything kind of went back to the self. Like that I actually did have power to stand up for myself. I did have power to, express my needs, and that my needs were just as important as anybody else's, regardless of whether you're an adult or not.
mm,
But then I also learned how to kind of navigate and negotiate, my needs and other people's needs, and learn acceptance. And so all of this stuff related to the self kind of emerged when I was in that internship, and that experience that like, oh my God, I just felt completely powerless. And then when I learned about this stuff, I was like, oh no, and I have a feeling that there's so many people in this world that struggle with the same thing, is that they don't realize that they have the power to influence their relationships. They have, of course, we can never guarantee that we'll get what we want, but there's ways of learning to work with people, and and exploring ourselves and our own struggles and insecurities that's preventing us from getting what we want.
mm,
So I guess, yeah, long and short story, of how I got into this field is basically, it was a very personal
mm.
experience of mine.
What a beautiful like story. Like I was like just so focused on what you were saying. And I love that you went to college and you're like, I think I want to become maybe a fitness instructor. And your coach was like, yeah, we don't do that. But how about you want to take some psychology class?
That's like, yeah,
That killed me.
that's like, this is what I tell all the undecided students. I'm like, just go major in psychology.
I know that's why I ended up getting a
Yep.
major in communications.
Yeah, exactly. It was either that or criminal justice.
It's funny that was my other, that was because I was in a major that actually was partially psychology, but then partially criminal justice.
Oh my gosh,
Look at
that is
that.
so funny. Well, see, I almost majored in psychology because all of this is very fascinating to me, but my psychology professor, it was a very small college, and he drove me nuts. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't be with it for 4 years.
I thought that you were going to say that the psychology professor was like, don't major in psychology.
No. No, he had like this gross like thing that hung from his I couldn't do it.
Right.
Anyway, so
Wait, could I ask a follow-up question? Go ahead. You want to ask it? Go. You go.
I want to go first. Okay.
Okay.
So there's so many places that we could go from here. And I know we sent you some questions ahead of time. And Jared, maybe you can help me stay on track with that. But I love the word assertive. And it was something that we talked about in my coaching program with Dr. Morgan, who you know. And it's something that I think women don't learn as much as men because we're in a society where we've grown up and we've seen through the patriarchy that we aren't necessarily allowed to be assertive, and if we are assertive then we're known as bossy or bitchy or whatever it is. So can you maybe explain assertiveness to our audience and like what that would look like for anyone, men or women, and in maybe specifically in relationships?
Yeah. Assertiveness is basically just our ability to know what we want and communicate it in a direct way. And I agree with you. I think that women who are assertive tend to be characterized as, um, unfeminine and intimidating, and all of these, negative words that cause us to think that it's going to make us unattractive to men.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to dating, I think that that's why women tend to struggle so much, is that they have this picture of, what a woman is supposed to look like and what it takes in order to attract a certain type of man that they want. And there's so much out there about how women who are needy and clingy, those types of women are unattractive. But then at the same time, the women who are too demanding are also unattractive. And so it's confusing for us sometimes, like, okay, like how do I express what I want? And so it definitely, causes us to, express or experience some self-doubt about, who we are and what is okay to ask for and what's not okay to ask for. So I think that assertiveness really is, it's a way of saying like, well, my needs actually do matter. Society is wrong that, we shouldn't be able to express our needs, and society, is wrong about the fact that I want too much just because I express a need. Because the problem with that is that if we don't express our needs, then we don't get them. We don't get them met. If we don't get them met, we're gonna get them met in other ways. It's not like just because we don't express a particular need that somehow this need is going to go away. So, for instance, if we need, attention, and we don't express that need for attention, maybe later on we're going to become upset and we're going to get angry and we're going to complain to our partners, you never pay enough attention to me, versus, hey, I'd really like to talk to you about this. Can you give me a couple minutes? So I think that assertiveness is very important in a healthy relationship, because it basically just puts everything on the table. It's like, this is what I need from you, without having to kind of beat around the bush and try to get these needs met in another way.
And assertiveness is a huge part of self-esteem and self-worth, because when you feel like you're worthy of getting what you need, then you can be assertive and ask for it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Jared, go ahead now. Sorry,
No, you're great. No, actually, this leads perfectly into the question I was wanting to ask anyway, because I kind of want to go back to that moment where you're in your internship and the supervisor sort of kind of chastises you in front of someone, right? And what I related to in that is, I mean, obviously I'm a man, so I have like a whole other set of privileges, but also I always grew up and was someone who like sort of shrank, especially when other people would get loud, or get angry around me. Like I would have that freeze reaction, And so I sort of like was kind of projecting like that onto you a little bit. And so for me, like I remember being almost 30 and really doing the work of dealing with that. And before I did that work, I felt like the pattern for me was having that freeze reaction and then like later on being like resentful and like mad at myself for like, wait, why didn't I say something? Like I was right here. Like I had every right to, and like, so I'm curious, like, what was that like for you before you kind of underwent this change, and like what was the work like for you to actually like make that change in your life?
Yeah, that's so relatable what you just said, because that's exactly what I would do. Every time somebody would somehow violate a boundary of mine, or every time I would kind of shrink, I'll later on beat up myself for it, and I'll think like, oh, you should have said this, you should have done that. And that's kind of where I was talking about with my mom, where on the one hand, I needed to be respectful and obedient of authority. But then on the other hand, she did teach me to stand up for myself. It's just I didn't know when I should and shouldn't stand up for myself. And
Mm.
so I think that a really big part of my work in learning to become more assertive is that I needed to recognize that I was an adult, that I was no longer this little kid that needed to, just allow adults to do whatever they want to do, and and behave however they want to behave, and that I just needed to keep my mouth shut because I was this kid. So it's kind of funny, like before, like even now, so as you're asking, how did I start working on this? I'm still working on it all the time. I mean, even before, when I was talking about this story, and I said I almost called this staff member an adult. I was like, wait, no, you see, like, so it's like my mind is still reverting back to like, oh, this is how you're supposed to act when people are older than you and these authority figures. And so what happens is that we start to experience these threat responses in our bodies whenever we feel like somebody's towering over us. And what needs to happen is that I've learned that I don't need to respond right away to everybody. I've also been practicing, certain responses to people if I'm not, comfortable, I guess, responding to them immediately. So if somebody says something to me, and I'm never going to be able to expect what they're going to say. And so what I'll do is I'll just remind myself, like, okay, you don't have to say anything right now, and it's okay to come back later to talk to this person,
Mm.
and and let them know how you felt in that situation, versus just feeling like you needed to have a perfect response every single time. So I think that when it comes to self-esteem, it has a lot to do also, not just what happens to us when we're dealing with people, but how we talk to ourselves afterwards. Like,
Mm.
so part of this process of becoming, I guess, a stronger me was just being compassionate with the fact that, like, well, you're not a fighter, you know and just because you stand up for yourself or not stand up for yourself, it doesn't mean that you're weak. And so it was really a new way of being able to look at these situations and talk to myself, so that I'm not just constantly beating myself up for not being able to do what I was actually taught not to do when I was growing up.
Mm.
So that self compassion is huge.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you said like you allow yourself, like you don't have to respond to that right away. And I like that for me, but in the opposite way is I can be hot-headed and I'm very direct and assertive, um and I've gotten to, I mean, well, okay, hold on, except for around men. I think that I kind of shrink around men. Um
Mm-hmm.
and so I think sometimes when I've started to find my voice, I can be a little bit um a little harsh.
Mm-hmm.
Jared's laughing because I tend to, like, I call guys out on their shit like a lot.
Uh-huh.
And in the past, like I've given them like lectures and like this, I even like, just a very like brief quick example, like I've got this I rent an office space downtown, and there's been this huge noise that's coming into the office space, and I've been complaining about the noise ever since I moved in 5 months ago. I've just been like, hey, listen, there's a rattle, there's a rattle, there's a rattle. And then he comes, the super comes in. He's like, no, there's not. Like, it's just this. It's just this. And I'm like, okay, whatever. And finally, the rattles to the point where you can't even hear the other person talking. And I'm like, hey, you need to come in here. And he's like, isn't this just the same noise? And I'm like, no, something's wrong. You need to fix it. And so then I finally got to the point where, like, why is he it's almost like he was gaslighting me because he didn't want to fix it. And so he's
Uh-huh.
like, no, this is normal. And I'm like, I can't even hear myself think. So anyway, he goes up to the roof, and there's like a belt that's about ready to break on this like machine. And it's like, if I hadn't complained for 5 months, and now I'm like, okay, I'm not going crazy. Like, for 5 months, this noise. Anyway, that's like just me really venting about the situation that I've been going through. But but also, I felt really proud of myself for being very firm with him and not letting him tell me, no, this is just, and I'm like, no, it's not. Like, please go look, like, go fix it. And I promise you, if I were a man, like, and this goes back to like men, woman, that wouldn't have even been a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yep.
mean, maybe, but I mean, I would say generally, yeah. So, so let's go into a little bit of, like, specifically talking about self-worth now, and maybe just generally, let me
Ooh,
look at,
go ahead.
yeah,
Do you want
Jared,
to do
take
it?
it away, because I'm
S-
lost for words. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like one of the things is I don't think many people go, you know what? I think I need to work on my self worth. Right. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
wondering, so people might be struggling with self worth and not realize it. So, like, what are some signs that a person might want to do some work around this?
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good question because it's so true. Like when we grow up in a certain way, we don't know to ask questions, So when we have low self-esteem or or low self-worth or anything like that, we just assume that that's just the way that life is and that's just the way that people are and and we don't really question it until somebody comes into our lives and says like, "Huh, it sounds like you don't really trust yourself. So some of the signs that we might be struggling with self-worth can be seen in the ways that we kind of talk to ourselves and the way that we treat ourselves in comparison to what's going on around us. So for
Mm.
example, if we tend to be more hard on ourselves when we make mistakes in comparison to how we perceive somebody else, one of the analogies that I love to use is, for instance, well, not really analogy, but I like to have my clients envision, if you were a little child in your kitchen, and let's say you grabbed a jug of milk and you spilled it, what would your mom say to you? And, depending on what this response was, that is a really good sign for me of how this person views themselves when they do bad things or when they make mistakes. So if this child would
Mm.
have said, "Oh, my mom probably would have just, run over and said like, "Oh, like, are you okay? Here, why don't you help me clean this up? This is what you could do in the future, to make sure that you don't spill the milk again." Or, why don't you just tell me if you need some milk in the future versus like, oh my God, you are so clumsy and, never touch the milk again. And, you drop everything. So usually those are really good signs for us of how we view ourselves and mistakes that we make. And that really impacts how we see ourselves and our self
Hmm.
worth. Another one is when we don't really believe in ourselves, we might tend to be more indecisive and afraid to take risks.
Hmm.
If we frequently put others' needs before our own, that usually means that other people's wants are more important than ours, and that comes from a childhood of just constantly needing to kind of manage emotions and make sure that that our loved ones don't abandon us and that they still love us and that we're still lovable to them. When we feel like things rarely go our way, that also relates to self worth because that relates to boundaries and assertiveness, right? Like if we don't set boundaries, and because we don't believe that we deserve to get our needs met, and that other people are more important than us, then we might not stand up for ourselves when we might not assert our needs. We might also have a tendency to minimize our own needs and assume that other people will as well. So, if you really, really need something, you might not say that you need it or acknowledge that you need it. And you might even assume, well, other people won't think that this is important either. And then lastly, another really big sign is when we tend to be very dependent on other people. So, talking about self-sufficiency, it's like we over rely on other people for our happiness and, in order to do things for us. And this kind of relates to risk taking, is that we're so afraid of taking risks because if of what it could mean about us if we make mistakes or fail. So all of these are pretty common signs that a person would have, some self-esteem and self-worth issues.
Along with the kind of the parental figure, which I know I'm sure goes a ton into self-worth of how we grow up too. Do you think also like a parental figure who has low self-esteem and maybe says negative things about themselves constantly, or maybe who's
Mm.
dieting constantly and talking about, certain things, like can that affect your self-worth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that children, they learn in, you know, many different ways. One is by modeling, and then the other one is, through the experience of, how they actually experience their relationship. So when even if they had a parent who was extremely loving or tried to be very loving, but the parent had a tendency to be very negative in the way that they respond to situations, that's going to really impact the child and the way that they see things too.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if something would happen and a parent were to freak out, the child would then look to the parents like, oh, that's how you're supposed to respond to situations. And so as a result of that, this child's is probably gonna be more anxious and and not sure of themselves when it comes to resolving conflicts in their lives, and they're going to be more likely to run away from conflicts. And when they don't have this nice little track record of being able to succeed and achieve and work through problems in their lives, then that's going to really impact their self-esteem and this feeling that like I'm not capable of being self-sufficient and being independent.
Mm-hmm. So that hits super close to home. Jared, does that hit close to home for you too?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, so how does that then go into dating, right? Because if your self-esteem is low, well, actually, okay, let me see this. What do you think the population of the population, don't you think all of us are kind of struggling with self-esteem, self-worth, especially in like social media world today and like what the beauty standards are and like all of these expectations that we have on ourselves? Like, do you think everybody's struggling with it to a certain point? Like, are there people that aren't struggling with this?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, if you were to ask me, I think that every single person in this entire world needs can benefit, not need, but can benefit from some sort of help in self-esteem and the way that they see the world and navigating the world. And that is mainly because we live in a world with a lot of different people. We can't always predict who's going to come into our lives, and we need to learn how to respond to situations in a healthy way and be able to just never just navigate the world in ways where where we can feel strong and not allow problems to negatively affect us, in a very extreme way. So I do think that every single person in this world, can really benefit from, just yeah, learning how to improve the way that they see themselves and how they communicate with other people, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and how to be in relationships with other
Right.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a great lead into the next question is like, how does this show up in dating? You know, if
Hmm.
you have low self-esteem or low self-worth, how does that look like when start when you meet someone?
Yeah. So in terms of dating, I think that our low self-worth a lot of times can discourage us from taking chances with people that we want to be with because we don't think that we're good enough. And
Hmm.
Mm.
so, if we, let's say, have a certain standard of like, oh, this is, the kind of partner that I would really want, and we actually meet this person that seems to fit a lot of these qualities that we're looking for, the lower that our self worth, the less of a chance that we're going to either pursue it, or even if even if this person comes and asks us on a date, we might not really trust it.
Hmm.
So this
Mm.
idea of having low self worth and low self esteem, it's kind of like the self fulfilling prophecy, and we're just constantly looking for evidence in order to prove this correct. This belief that we have. So if we believe that we're not that great, then we might just, and a partner comes and tries to ask us out, we might just assume like, oh, this person's just being nice, or oh, it's because they don't really see who I am.
Hmm.
And how that could later impact us is it could cause us to feel like we need to put up a certain front, right? It's like, oh, wow, this person's actually showing me attention, then I'm going to have to look this way. I'm going to have to dress this way. I'm going to have to pretend that I don't want this, and pretend that, and so what it does is it causes us to show up in a very inauthentic way because we believe that who we actually are is not worthy enough. And another big thing I see a lot in dating is that it really intensifies our experiences with rejection when we have low self worth.
Hmm.
Mm.
So we might become hypersensitive to any signs of rejection. So maybe if this person that we went on a date with, in the very first date, they seemed extremely interested and into the conversation. But let's say on date 2 or 3, suddenly this person, is it's like, oh, he didn't want to hold my hand today. That must mean that he's starting to pull away.
Hmm.
And and then we have a tendency to kind of take it really personally.
Hmm.
Of, well, what could that mean? Like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. He's just not interested in me anymore, and that's what's happening. And so what ends up happening is that you might back off of the relationship and feel like, yeah, this is probably not going to go anywhere. And so when things like that happen, it really prevents us from getting the person that we want.
Hmm.
Mm. Yeah, I mean,
Well, I was gonna just say really quick. So Jared's face lit up with some of the things that you were saying. Jared, what struck you?
I had, yeah, I had an experience when I was like 17 years old that I like really like fell for somebody and had like extremely strong feelings for this person. And like, I was like, the the beliefs I had about myself at that time is like I was like I was like a fucked up kid. I came from like a fucked up family, and I would like go out and like drink and party and stuff like that. And this person that I fell for was like, she was like super smart, and she was like one of like the good people, you know? And
Mm.
and there was like there was like this very dramatic scene the way it played out where like there was a moment and I totally just kind of bailed out, and because I was like, I'm too fucked up to be with this person. You know what I'm
Mm.
saying? Like she, like, why would she ever want me? That kind of thing. And I was like heartbroken, like
Mm.
destroyed. So like as
Oh
you were saying that, I like
man.
really related to. I have like a really intense example of that in my life.
Yeah. And what's funny is that you're probably exactly what she needed.
Hmm. Could be.
Aw.
Oh yeah, that's like so sweet of you, Dr.
I
Betsy.
have one more comment, Jared. It's really funny when Dr. Betsy is talking, you and I both go, at the same moment.
Well, okay. There was also a moment, Leanna. I'm curious, what thing did Dr. Betsy just say that you related to? Because I have a couple of guesses.
Well, I mean, I think my thing is I just always think I'm going to be abandoned, you know. It, but I don't know. And Jared, you know me really well, so you can pop in here. I don't know how much of that is self-worth and how much of that is just trauma that I've been through.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are those things related? Because I feel like I'm a pretty confident, self-sufficient person. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I've always been pretty confident, but I also think it and we talked about this in last week's episode with Dr. Fedrick, that it you know, it can be kind of a front for me to come across as this like boisterous, like really confident, self-sufficient person, but really deep inside, like I'm really a sensitive soul and my feelings get hurt really easily. And I just don't feel like I can really show that sign of it because that's too like vulnerable almost.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a self-worth thing, or is it like, I guess I don't know. Do you kind of understand what
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not really putting
Yeah.
my words together well.
Yeah. I think that our issues with self worth are trauma responses.
Mm.
Like we went through something in our childhood that caused us to believe that we're not lovable enough to have the attention of these people whose attention that we really, really need.
Mm.
So when you talk about, talk about your self worth, I think that what it really is that I'm not that interesting. I'm not that great for somebody to want to stick around in my life. So, for instance, children whose parents didn't really show enough of an interest in them, in who they were and what made them special, these children, they're still going to have this need of feeling special. So when the parents, who are responsible for making this child feel unique and special, fail to do that, this child is going to look elsewhere, right? Like they're going to look external and say, oh, well, that person is lovable by these people. And so maybe I need to be that way.
Mm.
Or, oh, mom likes me better when I don't cry. So when I have needs, I'm just not going to say anything. Or, maybe even when you get a little bit older, you talked a little bit about social media earlier, right? And self
Mhm.
esteem. We might look at, popular Kardashians. It's like, oh, you see, they drive that car, they have those shoes, so I want those things too, so that
Mhm.
I can be just as worthy. So
Mhm.
I think that all of this, really comes from, you know, having this childhood of just not really feeling special and important enough to not be abandoned. Because if you really think about it, if a child was super, super confident in who they were and they felt like, oh, I am really special and this is what makes me special, then they're not going to feel like somebody else can take their place so easily, right?
Mm.
So if I'm this really, really good person, or I have this really special relationship with this one person that cannot be replaceable, then I'm not going to worry that this person is going to ever abandon me. And I
Mm.
think that that's where vulnerability and intimacy come in order to contribute to security. Is security is like, it's this feeling that these people, no matter what, are going to be reliable in my life. I can count on this person to not abandon me, regardless of what they see me as or what they see in me. So I can be as flawed as I want, and this person is still there for me,
Mm.
right? And so as a child, again, like when a parent can kind of show interest in us, and so even if we make mistakes, the parent is able to say like, oh, it's okay, sweetheart, just keep going. Like let's try this way. This child is going to feel like it's okay to take risks, because if
Mm.
I take risks, this person still has my back.
Mm.
But a child who didn't really, get that kind of that kind of support from their significant relationships. Let's say the child, again, that milk incident that I shared earlier. Um, a parent that yelled at a child and made them feel bad about making mistakes, this child will be afraid to take risks in the future. And not taking risks will contribute to them, never really learning to grow at a pace that is, similar to that of everybody else, and for them to be able to feel self-sufficient to do things. They're always going to feel like they need to rely on other people in order to, to feel like they aren't going to make mistakes, and that they're going to be able to maintain these relationships in their lives, right? Because mistakes equals abandonment. So again, I think that this issue of self-worth, it really is a trauma response from our childhood relationships, and kind of just having caretakers that really didn't know how to respond to mistakes that we would make, how to foster our uniqueness in order to make us feel extremely secure in the relationship.
Mm. Yeah, that's pretty spot on.
I love that. Yeah. Well, and I love, when you were giving the sort of spilling the milk example earlier, it just struck me how much when we're children, how adults talk to us like becomes like directly the voice that we talk to ourselves with.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, you're clumsy, you're in everyone's way, like, whatever it is, right? Like that kind of thing. I'm curious, Dr. Betsy, because of and I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but because of the conversation we had with Dr. Frederick last week, as you were talking, something I related to is when I was like a teenager, I think because I didn't feel really good about myself, my sort of defense was to build this like costume, right? To build this, it kind of like the way I think about it, I was like stepping into like an Iron Man suit that looked like a angsty, trying to be cool teenage boy. And so I'm curious, like, well, and what's nice is there's a lot of aspects of toxic masculinity that like I think a lot of young men learn to emulate, like not particularly caring about things, like trying, like not being particularly like nice to other people, probably just like pursuing women without like actually caring about them or being, nice and a good person towards them. And I still carry around like a lot of shame for that part of my life. But I'm curious, like, what is the difference between the way people can sort of build up this like fake ego self? Because like a lot of times when people hear self-esteem, it's like, okay, well, we're supposed to tell children that they're wonderful all the time, and everyone wants to be special. And, there's like a lot of criticism of that. And so the conversation we had last week was about like narcissism. And so I'm curious, like, how do you sort of disentangle those in your work?
Yeah. Kind of, I wanted to connect this to something that Leanna asked me earlier about, do you think that everybody needs self-esteem work? And this is kind of what I thought earlier. I forgot to mention it, but the truth of the matter is that narcissists, they actually are like very wounded on the inside, and that's very, very different from self-confidence. And I think that, so true self-confidence is not somebody who, only hears positives about themselves. And, true self-confidence means this almost ability to trust yourself to get through situations, trust yourself to be able to get back up and still move forward and succeed in life, versus this need to kind of behave in a certain way to look like you're confident. I don't know if I'm answering.
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah. And you used the term earlier, right? I'm a huge fan of like Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion, right? And this idea of, because I think when we think about self-esteem, like a lot of it is like, I have to come in first, in the contest or whatever, or in the sports championship, and then I'll be worth something. And so I gravitate much more towards when people use the terms like self-compassion, self-love, and self-acceptance, which is also like making mistakes and maybe like hurting other people that we care about, and still like accepting and loving ourselves, because like we don't have to be perfect. And I loved in the story you told from your internship earlier that part of the problem for you was not just the way you responded when the supervisor started talking negatively towards you, but that you kind of like replayed that in the way you talk to yourself afterwards, right? And I think,
Right.
yeah, and so I know that that's been an important shift for me in my life, was realizing like the difference between those two things.
Yeah, I think, yeah, kind of along the same lines of that, when I was talking about security in relationships, this feeling that somebody has your back no matter what, and this is what we needed as children from our caretakers, and it's what we seek when we look for romantic partners. But I think confidence really is, you have to be able to have your own back as well, right? So when you lose a race, it's okay to talk to yourself in a way that is more compassionate. Like, it's okay. This doesn't mean anything about who you are as a person. You're still a great person. You're still a great athlete despite all of this. So I think that, yeah, a lot of self confidence has to do with being able to just kind of be there for yourself, be this cheerleader for yourself sometimes. And again, not in this way where it's like, people lately have been using the word toxic positivity, right? Not in a way
Mm,
where you're just dismissing
Mm-hmm.
anything. You're able
Mm-hmm.
to acknowledge that, like, okay, it does matter that I got second place. It does matter that I didn't get the job that I wanted, but let's take a look at what I can do in order to keep moving forward.
Mm.
Let's see what got in the way of me getting this job that I really wanted, and get myself back up and keep moving forward, versus allowing these types of situations to kind of define who we are and define our worth.
mhm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, oh, sorry. Can I just add
Yeah. Go
one
ahead.
button to that? I mean, I think of it as like finding like love and acceptance for myself that still like allows room for like intentional self improvement, but also that love and acceptance I have for myself has nothing to do with like external things at all, either like coming
Mm-hmm.
in first, or someone telling me I did a great job, or someone telling me how attractive I am, or whatever, right? Like
Right.
having that for myself. And then, because if it is tied up in that external stuff, then when I experience that rejection or something like that, then all of it crumbles, versus,
Mm-hmm.
like when you need that self-worth and self-acceptance the most is when you experience that rejection. And when you were talking about the dating piece, Dr. Betsy, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who talk about going on this cycle of, they download the internet dating apps and start doing them, and then just get overwhelmed and start feeling really terrible about themselves and delete them, and then 3 or 4 weeks later, like rinse and repeat, right? And I think that's because you're just seeing all these little like you're getting this micro feedback of like, wow, I'm like liking all of these, good looking people or whatever it is. And then the people that keep showing up in my inbox that are liking me are like not the type of people I want to be with. What does this say about me? It's all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um. Oh, so what I was gonna say in regards to what you guys were just talking about is of being okay, when like, or having that self compassion for yourself if you come in third or don't even place or whatever, is going back to what we were saying about the abandonment conversation of like, okay, not only am I worthy enough to not be abandoned, but if that relationship ends, I'm strong enough that I'll be okay. Like there's that aspect too
Mm-hmm.
of of like gaining your self-worth, that like you said, like you won't crumble when rejection happens or
Mm-hmm.
things end that you didn't necessarily want to end.
Right.
um I was gonna also, when you guys were talking about like the sports analogy, I was thinking of Dr. Betsy. Are you a fan of the Bachelor shows?
I'm not.
Would you like to
I
come?
watch I
Yeah.
watch reality television, but I actually haven't been watching The Bachelor at all. So
Honestly, it's great. It's probably better that you don't. But what's so funny about it, and this reminded me of what you guys were saying, is they always have these like competitions for the guys or whatever,
hmm
that are
Oh
trying to
yeah.
win over this one woman. And the guy, every season, the guy comes on and he's like, well, I'm going to get in first place because then I know she'll want to be with me. And that's like not a part of it at all. Like that has nothing to do with if there's like a genuine connection or not, you
Right.
know? And that also makes me think of my boyfriend who like openly admits that he's not good at athletics. But he's like a very like tall, handsome man and he's smart, but he's just like, yeah, no, I'm just not really good at sports, you know. And it's just it's part of that of just like accepting who you are, and not trying to just win something because that's the achievement and then you're going to gain the self-worth and then someone's going to love you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you see it's so internal, all of that stuff that you're saying right now, right? Like if this guy doesn't win, then it's like, oh, it means something about me and this girl's not going to choose me, but she's probably not thinking that at all. That's just an assumption that you're making. It's just like self dialogue, and same thing with your boyfriend. He's not athletic and he assumes that you have a problem with it, which clearly you don't. But he
Mhm.
assumes this because of the way that he was socialized, to
Mhm.
be a man and what it means to be manly. And the problem with that is that sometimes it causes us to act in a way that actually causes our partners to push away a little bit, right? So if he's
Mhm.
going to
Mm-hmm.
be extremely, extremely insecure all the time and constantly need reassurance, but are you sure that it's okay that I didn't hit that home run, when we were playing with our friends or something? And it's those types of things that sometimes cause people
Mhm.
to push away because it's like they feel like it's overwhelming. It's like, oh, I need to constantly reassure you and I constantly
Mhm.
need to make you feel better and you're so emotional. And so I think that, yeah, we always have these beliefs of what other people expect of us, and but it's just not true. Especially
Mhm.
reminds me of this really fun term that me and this one client of mine like to throw around. He brought up he made up this phrase called the universal line of morality, because every time we talked, like one of the things that he struggled with was self-esteem as well, and masculinity, and and so we're just constantly talking about how there's not this like invisible standard in this world that everybody else seems to meet, but you don't.
Mhm.
But I think that that's what we think a lot. Like people that struggle with self worth have this assumption that, like, oh, there's this invisible line and there's this invisible standard that everybody else seems to understand and know and judge me about because I'm just not enough, and that line just doesn't exist
Mm.
whatsoever.
Mm.
Like there is no perfect level of confidence. There is no perfect way of asserting yourself. There is no best looking person in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that I like using that with this client of mine, because whenever he starts to compare himself to somebody else or worry that somebody's judging him in a certain way, I remind him of this, there's no such thing as a universal line of morality. You are the person that determines how
Mm.
worthy you are. You are the person that gets to say, are you a good person, not other people, you know?
Mm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that a lot of times we assume that there's this standard that we just don't meet, and that's what makes us unlovable and unworthy.
Well, and I think that's interesting too, like within this topic. And I'm really glad Jared is here with us because I think it's probably not as okay for men to be like, yeah, I don't have self-worth, or like my self-esteem is low. And maybe I miss said something about Zach, but Zach is totally fine that he's not good at sports. Like that's what I love about him. He's like, yeah, whatever, I'm not good at it, you know? But I think in a culture where men are supposed to be really athletic and really built and they're not supposed to cry and they're not supposed to have feelings, like it must be a lot harder for men to even come into that place where they're like, yeah, okay, I think I do need to work on my self-worth. Jared,
Mm-hmm.
what do you have? What are your thoughts with
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I think you're spot on. There's so much, like, as Dr. Betsy was talking, I was just thinking, like, relating for myself and all teenagers, but maybe perhaps especially like teenage guys, when you're in that like coming of age place, there's so much like, okay, so there's this ideal of like being cool, and if you're a guy, like being like manly, you know, or tough, or like whatever adjective you want to use. And so many guys I've talked to, and so I think it's a pretty universal experience, that you feel like that being cool and tough and manly is coming natural to every guy around you, and like you're having to fake it and doing a really shitty job of faking it. And holy shit, if people find out that I'm faking it, if people saw the real me, you know, like no one would ever be my friend. I would be a laughing stock, right? All of these things. And so you're kind of walking around in this like paranoid place all the time of like, wow, everyone else just gets this and does it naturally. But meanwhile, all these other guys that you're assuming like are just naturally cool and manly, they think they're the only ones faking it too.
Yep.
Right. And everyone is doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that perfectly describes that universal line of morality, right? It's like you just assume that you're the only uncool one and that you're the only one that's trying so hard to look this way and and to be like all these other guys when like all of them are doing the same thing as you are. So yeah, and I feel like the most popular people tend to be the ones that are actually more confident in themselves because they because they're different, they're unique, they embrace their uniqueness, and I think that a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people look up to that. But
Mm.
then when we're kids, like we just always think that we just want to be like everybody else, we're so
Mm.
afraid to stand out, but the truth of the matter is that like when for example, I'm kind of thinking of my niece right now. My niece is 6 years old, and my sister really, fosters her uniqueness, and she's extremely popular with friends, and she's kind of the leader amongst her friends because she's not afraid to take risks.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas other, people who don't have as high of self-esteem and whose parents didn't really take much of an interest in, who they were, they're scared to take risks. They want to, follow somebody. They want to be like somebody else. It's like, oh, I'm going to be like this little girl and act like this little girl because everybody loves her, and so and so we end up becoming more followers, and then again it impacts the self-esteem again. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not that cool, and and I need to be more like other people. But the truth of the matter is like what you need to actually be is you need to be more like yourself. If
Mm.
you want to be cool, like you need to be more like yourself, not more like other
Mm.
people.
I love that. This has flown by. Like, I feel like
Mm-hmm.
we just started this conversation and we
Mm-hmm.
covered so many things. Can you kind of like wrap this all together for us and maybe give my listeners some key points of really how to kind of harness this idea of self-sufficiency and self-worth and yeah.
Okay, let me actually take a look at some of the stuff that I have first, and
Okay,
then
no worries. And I apologize. We like maybe asked a few of the questions that we sent over to
no,
you.
it's okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll probably comment on this a little bit after I finish the kind of summary part. But there were kind of some parts that I wasn't extremely happy with. Like I felt like I kind of rambled, and so if throughout your edit you're kind of feeling like you want me to kind of talk about something again, I'm happy to do that.
No,
Oh
Dr.
no.
Betsy, you were
Honestly, no.
fantastic.
I
Get out of
I
here
was
with
thinking,
that.
yeah, no, I was thinking the whole time, like, I'm not gonna have to edit this. Like this is
Oh.
perfect.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's my self-esteem stuff coming up, right? It's like I think I'm rambling, but maybe I'm not.
Well, so
No, I
actually, I wonder. I would love for us to keep this in because I also like. I think this is a great example, Dr. Betsy, of even as we get healthy and as we sort of grow into ourselves, even in our adulthoods and our career, like sometimes this stuff can be so domain specific. Like I'm sure when you're working with clients, like you don't have any of your second guessing stuff. But if I can share this, before we started recording, like you shared like this, like being on podcast stuff is like brand new to you. And
Uh-huh.
so, of course, like being in a kind of place where you're not as certain of yourself or whatever might trigger some of that. I don't know. I feel like that's so related to like what we've been talking
But
about.
honestly, like whatever you feel comfortable with, but this whole time I'm just like, I love every word that you've said. I think it's so valuable to us and to my listeners, and like we're so grateful you're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, feel free to share this, if you feel like it kind of helps to show, that self-esteem issues exist in everybody,
Oh yeah.
like even the
Yeah.
person that's talking about self-esteem. Yeah.
Well,
Like
and
embrace imperfection.
yes,
Yeah.
and we love to be very like honest and vulnerable about our imperfections and like our like insecurities, and so like I think it's perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I guess to summarize, one of the things I think is really important to explain is that, um, when it comes to self worth and self sufficiency, it's really important to understand that this doesn't mean that you need to be completely alone.
Hmm.
I think that a lot of times we have this assumption that self confidence and self sufficiency means that we are absolutely independent, and that we don't need anybody to make us feel better, and we don't need anybody in our lives in order to go through things, and that's really not the case. I think that for me, self sufficiency really is, and self sufficiency really is our ability to take care of our needs using whatever resources that we have accessible to us,
Hmm.
in a way that is effective and efficient. So, what that means is that we need to be able to, um, you know, take care of our own feelings, take care of our own needs, but also learn to allow other people to be there for us as well, because
Hmm.
that's what true security really actually is.
Hmm.
Um, you know, the reason why self-esteem really needs to come from within is that if we don't believe that we are lovable, we literally can never believe that other people will see us as lovable. So
Hmm.
if we personally view ourselves as worthless, we're not going to be able to receive love from a partner, because it doesn't make sense to us. Like we can't empathize with that. So our partner can tell us all they want. I love you. You are so important to me. You are irreplaceable to me. But if you can't get on board with that, then you're going to have a really, really hard time accepting that. And that can really impact, our ability to be in relationships. So, in the end of the day, I think that the most important thing, in terms of how to work on self esteem and self worth is we need to learn how to be more vulnerable and accept ourselves, understand that, our needs are okay, who we are is okay, and to not be afraid to show that to the world, because the only way that we can develop that security that we're looking for is to be vulnerable. And one of the things that I like to use to help clients understand vulnerability from, I guess, the way that I see it is, if you imagine that I were to like kind of cut your face off and take your face off, and you could see everything inside my brain, right? Like all my thoughts and my needs and my feelings and my fears, my intentions, all of that. That's what vulnerability is that if somebody is able to see all of that about us, but still want to be in our lives, that vulnerability can lead to security,
Hmm.
and that sense of security can eventually allow us to feel more self-sufficient, so that we don't constantly worry about abandonment, and we don't have to experience those attachment wounds every time we sense any sort of dangers, that because we trust that we are good enough to deserve the love that's in our lives. And if we think we're good enough, then we'll see that the other people think that we're good enough. And as a result of that, yeah, we're not going to feel like they're just going to abandon us with every little thing that we do.
Hmm.
So I like to use, my relationship with my husband, for example, one of the things that I noticed, we've been married for about 3 years, we've been together for about 8 years now. And one of the things that I noticed about my relationship with him is that there's this side of me that nobody else in the world knows. Not even my mom and dad know this particular side of me. It's this super, super silly side that, I talk to myself, I say weird things to him. And, and sometimes I even ask him, is like, am I annoying you? And he's like, yes, you're annoying me. And those kinds of exchanges actually feel very securing to me because I know he's not going to leave me. I know that even though he's annoyed at me, he's not going to leave me. I know that even though he sees this weird side of me that I'm so afraid that everybody else are going to judge me about, I know that he's not going anywhere. And that's what true security is. And with true security, with the fact that I know how different and special I am to him, because I know that no other person in his life, has shown this side of themselves to him, then I know that he's not just going to want to walk away from the relationship so easily. I know that there's something special about this relationship between the two of us and the way we interact, that makes it so that he's going to be there for me no matter what. And I think that that's true security and true self-confidence and self-worth.
Oh, so beautiful. I know we told you in the beginning, we're like, oh, no, we're not going to go over an hour. And it's like over an hour.
That's okay.
This
was a lot of fun. You guys are so fun to talk to.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, we're so happy you joined us. Tell our listeners where they can find you.
If you are interested in following me on Instagram, I post a lot about relationships and self-esteem. And my handle is lovealways.drbetsy. And if you're interested in reading about any of my work or perhaps even working with me, you can come to my website at www.drbetsychung.com.
Love it.
And Dr. Betsy, you and your husband are invited to come watch The Bachelor with me and Leanna and Leanna's mom. Anytime, you have a standing open invite.
I feel like I should watch it because there's so many therapists write about it on Instagram. But the thing that I actually love to watch is I love watching 90 Day Fiancé and Married at First Sight. So maybe after I finish all of those different spin-offs that they have, I think I could start watching The Bachelor.
It's just so interesting, the social experiment of it, of just same thing with Married at First Sight, 90 Day Fiance, Too Hot to Handle was crazy. Just seeing that these people are, what they deal with, and this is life, and I mean it's produced too, but anyway, yeah. Okay, well, thank you again. We love you for coming on here. You're amazing, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, guys.
Of course.